All right, I want to welcome everybody to Trillium's webinar series. This is the third session that we've had. Today's session is on 64-bit and what it's going to take in order to implement and understanding what is the next new technology push for JD Edwards. We've already had through two sessions. We had one on 9.2 upgrades and we had one on CNC. Those are available for recording and you can access those at the following website. If you have any questions after the presentation, feel free to reach out to myself. My name is David Toll. I'm the Director of Managed Services here at Trillium. My email address is up on the screen and we'll have it available later if you need as well. Helping me today at the presentation is Chris Papanow. He's one of our senior consultants here at Trillium, and he'll be going into more of the details of exactly how you go ahead and implement 64-bit. A few accolades about Trillium, just a little information about where we've done and what we've done throughout our career. We've been in business for 26 years, and throughout that time, we have helped up to 700 customers. And we have obviously won a lot of awards and have a good, strong presence in the United States. The one thing that many of you may be already customers at Trillium on the call, but you may not realize that we do a lot more than just JD Edwards. We do implementations, upgrades, managed services, and special projects for JD Edwards. But we also do help with software licensing, cloud integrations. We can even help you with our hosting. If you're looking to move JD Edwards to the cloud, we can help you determine which is the best solution for you. We work with all the big providers in private clouds. We don't care which hosting provider you use. We want to make sure you have the right fit for that. We also can do some custom development. Trillium has done over 100,000 hours of remote consulting in 2019. The reason why we want to bring this up is because with COVID going on, we want to demonstrate to you guys that we are capable of working remotely in considering a lot of the hybrid situations that many of your companies are going through in order to keep business moving, yet still social distance and work on projects across the internet. Trillium does have a monthly newsletter. This is a great place to get information on what's happening both with JD Edwards and Trillium. If you'd like to sign up, you can sign up at weknowjde@trillium.com. Just send an email to that email address and we will get you on the list so that you will receive the monthly newsletter. Trillium also is going to be offering a free JD Edwards 64 assessment for anybody who would like to do it. You need to reach out to me after the presentation today. My email address is dtoll@trillium.com. We'll gladly look at what your existing hardware looks like, what it needs to look like in the future, review your middleware versions, look at your third-party integrations. We can help you kind of identify where there could potentially be some issues with 32-bit and 64-bit. We can also take a look at your analyze what impact it has on your code. With 64-bit, there could be some retrofitting. There are some ESUs that would potentially need to be put in place, so we'll need to look at those as well. We'll be able to then kind of look at your options going forward. There's a variety of different ways you can take it, and then kind of provide a high-level plan for what it's going to take to go 64-bit. So for our agenda today, we want to talk about, first of all, what is 64-bit? We throw that term around a lot. You probably have heard it for 20 years now, but the fact that JD Edwards has not been 64-bit until rather recently, within the last year or two, is something that we need to understand what that means and how that correlates. We're also going to talk about why someone would want to go to 64-bit. It's becoming more and more of a likely scenario that we're going to need people are going to need to move to 64-bit sooner rather than later. Then we'll get into a little bit of the how, and then finally a little bit of the technical challenges on what it takes to move to 64-bit. So let's start out with the good question is, what is 64-bit? When you're talking about computers work on electricity. And basically electricity can be either on or off. There isn't a lot of representation. You can't have the number A in electricity, but you can represent that in an on-off sequence. So when you're talking, if you think about 4 light bulbs, if you know the code, you could pass information that way. For example, in this one, I can say that I'm going to turn the first light bulb on, and I'm going to turn on the last light bulb. Now, the fact that the 2 light bulbs in the middle are off is going to tell me something. In the world of binary, that's going to tell me, it's going to give me a number. If does anybody know what number that is? Yes, it's number 9 for all those of you guys who have guessed it correctly or understand this. Which leads me to this great question. If there are 1-0 types of people in the world, those that understand binary and those that don't. Yeah, I know virtually it's real hard to hear you guys laughing, but I know that you guys got a good chuckle out of that one. All right. Before I go any bit further, I'm going to ask you guys a poll question. I want to know who is currently using 9.2. So I'm going to go ahead and pop that up and let you guys answer. All right, we're seeing collecting results here. Give you guys a couple more seconds here. Awesome. So it looks like we got about 85% of you guys are using 9.2 already, which is great information. I'm going to go ahead and close that poll. Now let's get back to 64-bit. So let's talk about what the actual problem is. So 32-bit. So if you think about all those light bulbs, if you lined all those light bulbs up, there is exactly 4,294,967,296 different combinations of turning those light bulbs on and off. When first computers came out, Bill Gates was saying that this is about as much as you could ever possibly remember. However, what that really means is that when you're talking about memory, that really means that it's about 2 gigabytes of memory that you can allocate. When you're talking about CPU, we're talking about disk, we're talking about 4 gigabytes. These, when first started out, were huge theoretical values. In today's world, that's nothing. Your phone has more memory and more disk than some of these limitations. Microsoft and different OSs had to do and play some tricks in order to make larger amounts work, which means that there was a lot of issues with limits on memory, issues with large disks. They used to be FAT32. There's networking issues that go along with a 32-bit. And even if you do something as simple as go into Excel and you put in 2 to the 64th, which is bigger than 32, you can see it does some rounding. It's not giving you the proper answer. So it's something that you can kind of work and see that causes issues throughout your system. So the problem is that JD Edwards software has been 32-bit since the start. It's only been in the last 2 years that they've offered a 64-bit version. And to be honest, very few people have gone to the 64-bit option. If you're questioning whether or not you have gone 64-bit already, I can almost guarantee you have not. 32-bit can't hand native 64-bit commands. It's one of its limitations. So what happens is Microsoft Linux has an emulator that actually has to run its overhead that runs on 64-bit hardware so that you can run 32-bit code. In Microsoft, it's called 64 or the WoW64 emulator. Linux has a very similar type of an emulator. One of the other characteristics is the database drivers need to be 32-bit for JD Edwards. Some of you guys have experienced this when you try to go look at the ODBCs on a 64-bit operating system, and they're not there. You have to kind of go in that back way in order to find the 32 ODBC drivers in order to actually connect to your JD Edwards. Print drivers as well are 32-bit. I know we've had many customers have struggled making sure that they can actually print because of the difference between 32-bit and 64-bit print drivers. C compilers as well. There's also some third-party products that are only 32-bit. Things like PC Miler and Vertex have different versions, whether they be 32-bit or 64-bit. So your third parties will play into it. So how do we solve this problem? The answer is 64-bit, as you guys have probably already guessed. If you look at this number, I'm not even going to try to say that out, but that's upwards of 18 quintillion different options if you think about those as light bulbs lining up. It's a lot of space. If you think about it from a chessboard, if you put a grain of rice on the first box, and then 2 on the second, 4 on the third, 8 or 16 on the fourth, and keep going up, you will eventually have enough grain to cover almost the entire world. So it is a huge amount and a huge number, giving us a lot of options and availability as we move forward. So the answer to make JD Edwards 64-bit, first thing we do is Oracle's already ported the 32-bit tools to 64-bit. That's something that's going to happen in your system folders. You're going to have to recompile your code in 64-bit. You're going to need to provide a tool to convert any 32-bit business function C code to 64-bit. And clients are going to have to compile the 64-bit during package builds. What that really means is what's going to affect is really your enterprise servers, your deployment server, and your development workstations. That's where that core engine of JD Edwards works. What is already 64-bit is the Java components for web, HTML, ASS, orchestrator. So those components that use WebLogic are already 64-bit. Now, I will get a little bit confusing a little bit later because the enterprise server does use a version of Java that's 32-bit. So there's some confusion there where all the locations are that Java is used. All right. The why. Just one thing I did not mention, guys, if you have any questions, there is a question section over in your WebEx. Feel free to go ahead and pop those in there. Type them in. We're going to take some breaks along the way to answer them. So if you have any questions, feel free to enter them there. So let's talk a little bit about what's going to happen. Oracle has already indicated and hinted that they are going to discontinue 32-bit support. They have not told us when that's going to happen. They've not told us if it's going to happen tomorrow or if it's going to happen 4 years from now. However, since we already know that they are considering it, if you look at what they've done on the roadmap in the past, when 9.22 came out, it came out in November in 2017. 9.23 came out in 18. 9.2.4 came 19. They did something interesting on this slide that they've shown on their continuous model, that they went to a .d version for the next tools release. If they are following the plans, that would be November of this year. It's no guarantee that they're going to make it a 64-bit only version. However, if I was a betting man, I'd potentially put my money there. What that means then down the road is that your 32-bit, it's going to be more and more hard or difficult to continually update your system if you're not 64-bit. 32-bit options aren't going to be released for tools releases anymore, which is also going to affect how your code and everything else works. One of the other reasons, kind of the reasons why they're doing this is, as I talked to us, the enterprise server does run a version of Java. It's a 32-bit Java. To get real technical, it's in your metadata kernels and your publisher kernels, and it uses it there. JDK 8 was the last version that Oracle released on 32-bit. You can go out there on the web and try to find some information that there's a .9 version, but you can't find the download unless you're really creative about it. It's basically Java JDK 8 was the last one. That is actually off of support as of January 2019. That is one of the reasons why JD Edwards hasn't been able to find a pathway forward with 32-bit, because they need the 64-bit of Java in order to run. It's another indication that, since that Java is not being supported, they need to move their tool set forward as well so they can be on supported releases of Java. There are some advantages. Obviously, first of all, future-proofing. Once you're on 32-bit, you'll be able to support 64-bit operating systems will support the program natively. You won't have to run emulations. Your third-party vendors are probably already heading towards 60-bit, if not already there. 64-bit has been out for many, many years. I mean, when there's Windows XP, I believe was the last version that was only 32-bit. And JD Edwards will run in. There will be some it will get rid of that overhead that you have with CPU and runtime. One of the pluses and big pluses, you'll have a lot more memory space. Rather than currently, when you run a UBE, it only is allowed to use 2 gigs of memory, and you may get an out-of-memory error if you cross that. Now with 64-bit, it can grow exponentially larger. In lots of cases for big processing, that's great. We did see some performance improvements when people have done work. Since there is no overhead, there's less thing. Some of the decreased CPU times and run times in most cases. There is a white paper from Oracle. I did include that as a handout, so you feel free to grab that off the screen there and go from there. All right, I'm going to ask one more poll question before I hand this off to Chris for the how portion of this thing. But I want to know how many of you guys are have 64-bit on your roadmap. So I'm going to launch this poll and see what you guys are saying. All right, all right, we're getting some results in here. They're hovering right around 60-40. See if that changes at all here. Oh, going down a little bit here. We'll give it a couple more seconds. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and call the poll at 55% of you guys are saying, yes, you have it on your roadmap. 45% of you don't. Well, I will tell you that the 45% of you out there that don't have in your roadmap, you may wanna start considering it. All right, we'll close the poll. All right, at this point, I'm gonna go ahead and turn over the presentation to Chris Papineau. If anybody has any questions, obviously feel free to type them into the box there and we will answer them and follow them. And we will get to those near the end.
Okay, can people hear me?
I can hear you, Chris. I'm just transferring over.
Hopefully in a moment, you'll be able to see me. Whether that's a good or a bad thing. Most people can. Everybody see my slide?
It looks good, Chris. Thank you.
All right, very good. I don't know. That's not really enough people that are got 64-bit in the roadmap. Those of you know John Denver, he died about the same time as the first version of JDE came out, and people don't realize that he really was inspired by enterprise software. And there's some lost tapes that show he sang about it. Bet you didn't know that. Almost current 64-bit enterprise server, custom business logic. Your software's old now, older than XP. Move to 9243, be there or be square. Yeah, I'm not going to quit my afternoon job. You can see COVID has us with way too much time on our hands. But anyway, a little bit about me. Hopefully you're convinced by now to go to 64-bit. I just got to tell you how to do it. And to that end, well, I didn't always do exciting ERP stuff. I once worked in the aerospace industry, doing a lot of work that I could tell you all about it, but then I'd have to kill you all. So we won't get into that. I've worked with JDE Edwards 25 years. Well, how, Chris? The software hasn't even been around 25 years. Well, I was on the team of people that helped develop the original tools engine, the batch engine, the JDE 8net engine I was involved in. I also taught classes. I've also done a whole lot of work specifically on performance optimization and working customer issues. I was so inspired by doing customer issues that in January of 2019, I guess now, I joined Trillium after being, started in 1995 with what we'll call JDE Orasoft. I like to say that I've worked for 3 companies in a 25-year stretch, but didn't even change my phone extension. So that being the case, this next part of the presentation is the how. Okay, we've talked about why, get up to date and all of that, but what does that require? Is it anything drastically different than upgrades and installs that you're used to? Well, let's take a look at what it impacts and what it doesn't, okay? The 64-bit that Dave talked about impacts the enterprise server, the tools code in the C business functions, your development client, your tools code in the C business functions. And we say tools code, some of you might know that as foundation, or if you're familiar with poking around into the software as it's installed, it's all the stuff that's in the system directory, okay? The stuff that you don't have access to, all those DLLs, the shared libraries if you're on Unix, that is almost exclusively C and C++ code. The part of the code and the part of the product you do have access to the source and can customize is, of course, the C business functions in the path code part of the project, you know, the directory that's named PY or DB or whatever, that is also affected by 64-bit. The database drivers, okay, the DLLs, the libraries that allow the JDE Edwards software to connect to SQL Server or Oracle or the databases we support, those need to be upgraded to the 64-bit versions in order to work, okay? So that's the database driver, and the JVM also is affected. The Java version, you need to upgrade to the 64-bit JVM to be compatible with JD Edwards 64-bit. Now, what we're talking about here is the JVM that runs on the enterprise server to the extent that it's used for BI Publisher and whatnot. We are not talking about JAS, AIS, ADF, the JVMs that run those parts of the product, primarily because those already are 64-bit. Those are not impacted at all by upgrading to 64-bit. It's important to understand that this affects the enterprise server C code parts of the product, not the Java parts of the product, not JAS, not AIS or any of that. As Dave mentioned, print drivers also. You might go from 32-bit to 64-bit, find out that you can't print things that you used to be able to print because you need to upgrade your drivers as well. Come on. Oops, got to get the brakes fixed here. All right, so requirements here. Well, you need to be at applications 9.2, and I put in there because, well, you know, this is latest and greatest, okay? You can't go, if you're on XE or B73320 or whatever, they aren't going to provide a 64-bit, retrofit to any of the really old software, okay? So you got to be real current. The tools version has to be 923X, okay? Now, 923 will contain everything but the deployment server in 64-bit. If you go to tools 924, that level will also give you the option of a 64-bit deployment server. So your deployment server itself will be implemented in 64-bit as opposed to just being able to do 64-bit builds. Right? So basically, starting in 923, you're going to have 32 and 64-bit releases for all subsequent tools releases, okay? And again, the deployment server starting at 924. Now, this does not mean you have ESUs or apps code that are 64-bit specific. This is only tools code. The way ESUs and apps codes are made 64-bit, why? That's part of the process that we'll talk about. So if you look at change assistant, okay, and if you want to see the fact that there are 64 and 32-bit versions, you go to change assistant, and for some reason, the search that works for me that I found anyway that allows you to see the 64 and 32-bit, you go to the star all 9.2. For some reason, if you go to 9.2 and you go to the individual platforms or whatnot, at least the last time I checked, it may be different now, you couldn't see 64 and 32-bit. But if you do a search star all 9.2, you can see that you've got 9243 Enterprise Server, then you got 9243 Enterprise Server X64. That X64, as opposed to the version that doesn't have the X64 marked on it, that is the 64-bit. That's how you know that when you pull a 64-bit tools, that's what you're getting. As we alluded to earlier, what does 64-bit not impact? The JAS, the HTML stuff, it's already at 64-bit. It already is implemented in the form of a JVM that's at 64-bit, okay? There is no conversion to do at all for those parts of the product. All the Java-based modules, AIS, AIX, etc. Also, those of you wondering, the data itself, okay, this is not like the Unicode or the old NextID versions. Boy, there are people around here that remember that remember how long ago that was. Anyway, just take Unicode for an example that even to this day, there are customers, I think, that might be running a non-Unicode database. And to get to Unicode, you got to run a mass conversion. Well, there's no such equivalent in 64-bit, okay? The data works the same whether the code is 32-bit or 64-bit. So there's no mass data conversion. I'm sure you're all heartbroken at that. There's not another extra step here to destabilize or require extra regression testing. The application functionality itself. So there's no changes to the business processes itself. If you go to 64-bit, again, in theory, your users sit down, enter a sales order. They won't say, oh, look at this. I've got the 64-bit version now. No, that is a back-end thing, okay? The usability, the functionality doesn't change to the user, right? The server DBMS, other than the drivers, as we said, you need 64-bit database drivers to be called and work properly from 64-bit code. But the database engine itself does not need to be changed or upgraded in any way, right? That already is going to be compatible 64-bit. WebLogic WebSphere, again, the version you have, assuming you're current there and you're good, you don't have to make any changes to it. So while 64-bit is kind of a big deal, it is not as much of a big bang, hugely potentially destabilizing thing as some other big bang changes, such as when the software went out of coexistence mode, or when it went to Unicode, or when it went to the Next ID project. I won't explain what all those are, but those of you who've been around the JD Edwards world might know what some of those were, and this is not that, okay? This is less than that. Spec-based objects not implemented by 64-bit. By that I mean your interactive forms, the event rules, code, report layouts. Okay, so you don't have a 64-bit version of any of those Java servers like we said before. It's already 64-bit. It is the C++ tools part of the code. It's everything in system. It's everything in your path code directory. And what we'll allude to and specify later is that your bin32 directory, where your binaries are, your DLLs, that's going to become bin64. Okay? And that your binary, directory upon which you call business functions will be called from a bin64 directory. Okay, your deployment server client and your development client also potentially impacted. Third-party components. What do I need in place? What do I need to go and get to be ready for this conversion? Well, you will need a 64-bit Java JRE, once again, because the JVM that is on the enterprise server, that needs to be upgraded to 64-bit. Your database drivers, as we've mentioned, your ODBC drivers need to be 64-bit. There is a 64-bit Visual C runtime, specifically MSVC 2017. On the Unix versions, you'll need your 64-bit C, C++ compilers. Other third-party integrations. I think that this reiterates what David mentioned. Some of the slides: print drivers, Vertex, other PC, other rather third-party products. I can think of PC Miler, Reports Now, may require 64-bit integrations. So your 64-bit upgrade, basically, if you're used to doing a tools release upgrade, it is a garden variety tools release upgrade plus some extra steps that make it take a little bit longer and that require a little bit extra testing. So it's somewhere in between a regular plain Jane tools release and a full-blown upgrade, okay? It is not as complicated as an upgrade. It is slightly more complicated than a normal tools release because of the extra steps. Now, what we recommend, you could go to a phased approach, that if you're not at 923, you could go to 32-bit 923 or 924 first. Then run it until you're ready to do that next tools release and have that next upgrade be a 64-bit, in which you're performing the 64-bit steps and doing it to one path code at a time. The usual way: you start with DB, you move things up into the testing environment in PY before you go to PD, the way we all know and love. What this does is it isolates problems that are due to the tools release itself from those that are actually due to 64-bit. Okay, if you stay at 32-bit when you upgrade, okay, get that working, and that way any subsequent problems you'll know are perhaps due to the 64-bit steps. Changing one major variable at a time is usually the way you want to do this. So the tools release upgrade, without 64-bit, those of you who have been involved with upgrades or have done upgrades, it's, your basic lather, rinse, repeat. You go to Change Assistant, you get a whole big truckload of PAR files for your enterprise server, your HTML AIS deployment server manager. Boom, you've got all of these, PAR files. You have a planner ESU. You have a tool specific, sometimes called a tools roll-up enhancement ESU that contains any applications that you need in order to properly utilize the new tools features, for example. There will be a set of automated special instructions, of course, all the little doodads and UDC additions and changes to records to support certain modules. All of that happens. Then a full package build and deploy. Okay, that isn't nothing new. None of this is front page news. Those of you familiar with the upgrade process know that these are the steps. Okay, so basically the sausage, in other words, the external JD Edwards product is the same in 64-bit, but the installation process, the sausage factory, if you will, looks a little bit different. What is the net difference then? If I were to say, here's the tools release, and here's the tools release going from 32-bit to a 64-bit, what are the new steps? What's going to look different? What maybe might blindside you if you're not prepared for it? Okay. Well, I tried to highlight those here in red, and we'll go into more detail in some subsequent slides. First of all, you do all the 32-bit steps and test it. Like we said, that's kind of is the recommendation. Then you install the 32-bit versions of all the third-party components. Make sure those are in place. Okay, your JVMs, your database drivers, and whatnot. Then there is a step involving 64-bit business function ESUs that is called preparing for 64-bit business functions in parens. That is the way you will see it in Change Assistant. I'll show you graphics that show you what that looks like. The time frame that you're looking at hours. You're looking at about the same time as it takes to do, say, a full package build. Okay, there are something like 300-ish business functions that needed to be manually changed and modified to be compatible with 64-bit that wouldn't lend themselves to the automated process that we'll talk about later. So you have to apply that. But the good thing is you only do it once. Then manual retrofits of custom business functions. The time frame here, you would want to allow weeks to research this fully and test it. In other words, if you've done any kind of customization, whatnot, you might have introduced or might have coded things in a way that is not compatible with 64-bit, they will have to be, changed, upgraded to 64-bit. Gee, Chris, how the heck do I do that? How the heck do I know what's compatible and incompatible? Well, good news is Oracle has provided you with a detailed guidebook on that. There are about 3 or 4 different things, mainly time and size variables, and also long ints also go away, and we'll show you that in a minute. So it's mostly cookbook stuff, but it does have to be done. Then we've seen hours and weeks. There's another step that really is done in minutes, and that is called, you run something called a 64-bit special migration tool. SMT64 is what you search for in Change Assistant. All this does a few basic things. It creates a 64-bit registry entries, creates a 64-bit directory for your 64-bit DLLs. It upgrades your ODBC data sources to 64-bit. It's pretty straightforward, 10-minute process, okay? So it has to be done, but it's pretty quick. Then you update deployment and enterprise server if you're going to do the deployment server part, if you go into 9.2.4. And that's done the usual way via your, update component on Server Manager. Those of you who've done upgrades know how you do that. Then finally, your full package build and deploy. Don't know why I put that in red. That's not different for 64-bit. You always do that, but it's no different than anything else or any other upgrade. You have to build a package to get all of this stuff in sync and on the same page. So again, drilling into some of these, install the 64-bit version of your Java, your database client. Okay, so for a development client, you'll want to install the 64-bit client and be sure that its path comes first in the path variable. All right, that's something that I don't know about any of you guys, but this has tripped me up a whole lot of times, that you'll wonder why things aren't working, get strange errors, and it's simply because it's you're finding the wrong version of Oracle in the path. You need to move the 64-bit one up ahead. The Microsoft Visual C 2017 runtime. It's a very simple install, takes 30 seconds. From what I've seen, and in the upgrades I've done, haven't done one of the live customer site. I've done ones back when I was with Oracle way back in the day. I've done one within the past couple of months on our internal servers at Trillium. I have not found it necessary to install the entire 2017 compiler, just the 64-bit runtime. Okay. Don't know if Oracle would disagree with that or not, but that's been my experience. All right, so this step in the JDE Edwards 64-bit conversion process installs almost 300 ESUs and takes several hours. The answer is, what are they preparing for 64-bit ESU business functions? Here is a graphic of what Change Assistant looks like. And you can see that if you drill in to 9.2 in Change Assistant, you will find an entry, a saved search for you that's called Preparing for 64-bit Business Functions. And when you click that search, you will then see a tab that has 288 ESUs that impact 350-ish business functions. And it fixes many of the standard business functions for 64-bit compatibility. It does take several hours. You want to allocate the same amount of time as you would a full build, okay? But you only do it once. You don't have to repeat this in any way. Okay, now, what about the other code? What about all the thousands of business functions that aren't in these ESUs? Well, there is, as part of the 64-bit code that you install when you install tools, there is a code conversion utility that gets called automatically in one of about 4 or 5 different scenarios. Number one, you do a package build or a biz build, okay? It'll automatically, if it's a 64-bit system, it'll automatically do a check for a lot of automatable 64-bit fixes and do them for you automatically. Okay? Same thing, you check in a business function to OMW. Again, anything that is automatably changeable, did I just do a George W. Bush word there or something? I don't know. But at check-in, it does this. Also, ESU deployment. That's why you won't see, here's the 64-bit version of the ESU and here's a 32-bit version. No, you won't see that, so don't look for it. Anytime you deploy an ESU, anything that's not 64-bit compatible will get automatically converted. Now, I can tell you one thing, that back at the ranch at Oracle, the development that's going on, they're tending to make things all 64-bit compatible. So there won't be much that needs to be happening for a lot of the ESUs that you download that have been put out there since 64-bit has been a thing. But maybe if you're applying an older ESU, that conversion will happen just automatically. You can manually execute the conversion via UBE. That UBE there, that R96 64 conversion, I don't think there's too many circumstances into which you'd need that, but you can do it. But the important thing to remember is that it's a one-way conversion. You can't go back. Okay, if you've converted to 64-bit, you are 64-bit. Okay, it doesn't work. That once you're a cucumber and you become a pickle, you're that 64-bit pickle, forever. It changes the code in your F98 780H and R repository table. So again, once you're 64-bit, I don't know why you want to go back, but you're there for good. So remember that. It's a committing, operation. Remember, like we said, custom business functions could contain code that needs to be at least partially manually converted and retrofitted. In other words, stuff that is going to, flummox the automated conversion routine. Okay, in this code search research, again, it's a standard effort that probably is going to be time frames of weeks. I put in the name of that document if you would do Google search on that document. And once again, you don't have to scramble to write all this down because A, we're going to make the slides available to you, and B, the slides will contain an actual link to that document that tells you what the 64-bit incompatibilities, that could be in your code, in fact, are. And to that extent, this next slide gives you a very short version of kind of cracking that back box a little bit. What things in the C code don't play nicely with 64-bit? Well, if it's Windows, for code that's going to be compiled there on Windows Enterprise servers, for example, we no longer have decorated names. So in other words, the name of a function that begins with an underscore and ends with an at, the number of bytes that are passed into that function, you don't have that anymore. 64-bit just has the name of the function and not the at bytes and, and the underscore ahead of it. So that's a difference. That's an incompatibility. Also, data types. There are no more longs. They all become ints. They're 4 bytes everywhere. The time t and the size t variable. Well, we have created 64-bit compatible versions of these called JDE time and JDE size. And pretty much over the years, those of you that are familiar with our code know that when we needed to make something compatible, we just called it, slapped JDE at the beginning of it and made our own version of it. And that's what we've done there. So your automated conversion routine would do a search and replace in the .c's and the .h's basically. And again, the document goes into some other situations, some more obscure situations, things that might not work well with the automated conversion. The special migration tool we mentioned. You run it on the deployment server via Change Assistant. Takes a few minutes, changes registry settings, and rips out a few new ODBC data sources. It's not an issue, not really a problem. You just run it and you're done with it. So when you look at the 64-bit prepped system, you're now going to have in your path code directories, in addition to bin 64, live 64, source and include, instead of the 32-bit versions of those, now you're going to see ones with a 64-bit suffix on them. Okay? Package builds. And I'm sure you'll all be thrilled to learn this. You're going to have about a 17 to 20% hit on package builds because those 32 and 64-bit files have to be duly maintained, meaning that when you initiate a package build and all of those source and include files get pulled, FTP'd up to the enterprise server, it has to pull both a 32 and 64-bit version of those, because until which time that you go entirely 64-bit, different story altogether as far as what time frame and whatnot that happens, that there is dual maintenance, okay, of the 32 and 64-bit of all these source files. So it's just reality that your package builds are going to take a little bit longer. Back when a year and a half, 2 years ago, when I did this testing for Oracle, that was one very consistent result we got, and the reason was clear. Okay? As far as the compiler flags, it gets them from the 64-bit tools any. If you look in there, if you're curious, you'll see the switches in there that indicate 64-bit. Your change component via server manager. This is where you could get blindsided if you're not properly prepared. It's going to present to you a little bit of a twist on the UI that you're interested in. There are 3 different differences that I think that are there. One is you are asked for a system database password. The next 2, you're asked for paths to the 64-bit database client and the 64-bit JVM. See what that looks like. There are new prompts. Okay, so when I say it prompts you for a database password, I mean the system database username and password. What I mean there is the system username and password for the JDE 920 database. That is your foundation database, the database that has OCM and does it have data dictionary and all the things that are not environment dependent. Okay, all the stuff that transcends all the environments. That database password is what you will need to initiate and, with minimal frustration, complete the upgrade, because you will be asked for it. Same thing with your Oracle database client home location, that during the component setup, you're going to be prompted for that location and you'll have to type that in. So be sure to have that. The third thing to be sure to have ready to make this process a little less frustrating is the location of the 64-bit JRE on the enterprise server. Make sure you have that at your fingertips. Okay, so this is what it looks like. That system database password. Notice what it says there. Specify the credentials necessary to connect to the Enterprise One system data source. It is the database password, not the enterprise user one. So if this is something you don't have memorized or you don't have at your fingertips at all times like you do your other passwords, again, a way to prep for actually executing on installing these 64-bit components is to have that available to you. Again, you might see a pop-up that reminds you of 64-bit requirements, that reminds you of some of these things that come up. So you might see something that looks like that. Like, by the way, have these ducks in a row before you continue. Right? Your database client home directory. So this, what I've shown you here, happens to be a Unix, because you can see the Unix specification of a drive UO1, app Oracle product, client one, whatever, and that you would have to know is the 64-bit client that you would have already have to have installed and have in place. Okay. The JVM or the JRE. Again, this one, well, just for variety's sake, here is one that would be on a Windows machine. You can say Z, JDE, it's PPAC, etc., JVM, DLL. So you would want to specify that full path to that JRE location. And again, be sure to have that. I mean, write all this stuff down for minimal frustration when you're doing this. Also, when you change component on Server Manager, these 64-bit foundations, you need to choose component download from multi-foundation only, okay? That is something you want to be sure to do when you are installing the deployment server, okay, is that you install it in the mode that you just install the 64-bit, you know, so that the deployment server is capable of building things in multi-foundation, okay? So be aware of that. One thing you can do when you kind of, to make sure the process worked and to know, how do you know I'm dealing with a 64-bit, you know, version of something? Here is the enterprise server, the deployment server. You can see that x64 under the software component version when you look at Server Manager and look at the deployment of the enterprise server section. Now, one thing I think I glossed over before, I don't know if this is still the case, but the latest version of deployment server I was able to get to build and install properly is 9241. 9243, that par file for the deployment server seems to not work, seems to have been corrupt. I don't know if that's still the case or not. That could be fixed by now. They could have a new version out there, but that one didn't work. I put in 9241, it worked fine. Just FYI on that. There is, again, a new foundation, new 64-bit foundation directory. When you look at the multi-foundation setup on your deployment server, you can see the foundation names that have an x86 and an x64. So again, you can build 32 and 64-bit client packages from the same deployment server. They're named with that x86 or x64 bitness tag. When on the previous slide that we mentioned, you want to go with, you know, download the component only for multi-foundation, this is why. It allows you to build both 32 and 64-bit versions. Okay, that if there's some reason you want to maintain 1 foot in 32-bit land, just, you know, to test some things, okay, you'll want to have that. If you want to fall back on that, your deployment server can still build both types of clients. So again, recommended you build all new workstations and install 64-bit environments. If you're using existing workstations, you ought to be able to remove the 32-bit and install a 32-bit full package. And we recommend you keep one workstation as a 32-bit client until prod's converted and you're sure everything is ready, belt and suspenders, okay? kind of like rock climbing. You don't unclip, from the pitch you just finished until you're clipped in to the pitch you're about to climb. So there's never a time that you're just suspended in a rock face, with the potential to fall. And if you need both 32 and 64-bit, you can always use snapshot, okay, or other, kind of other Wild West means of having two path codes on the same development client. Again, just, as far as one overriding recommendation, test the heck out of everything. Over 7,000 objects are getting touched. In addition to the 300, business functions you get with those ESUs, you also get these automated conversions. So you should do a full CRP, treat it like you would any other, tools release that has significant, features in it. And with the whole new continuous development thing going on, why probably everything is treated like that. So it may make sense to do code current before the conversion. Okay, so part of your roadmap to get to 64-bit might be getting fully code current. Okay, depending on your situation, that might be a recommended thing. These are very good resources. Okay, down the bottom, the white paper that has performance characterization. Okay, that kind of tells you what to expect, and I'll go over very briefly what the kind of the results of that were. The three up top, where there's Oracle Learning Library, did a great job on a section implementing 64-bit. I would recommend, it's what I used to do our conversions to our internal servers, and it worked very well. The 64-bit compiler warning C program, there's a link there. I mentioned that before, and a short 3 or 4 page document on frequently asked questions. I'd recommend all these documents. Technical challenges. We'll go through these as quickly as we can here. The memory footprint increases. That's because the 64-bit pointers are larger. How much? The enterprise server, about 15 to 20%. The results, I showed the results for Linux there, and you can see there are 6 graphs, and each of them kind of present themselves in pairs for 100 and 250 and 500 users, and you can see it's very linear, that the 64-bit line is higher by 20% than the corresponding 32-bit line, and that remained very consistent from 100 to 500 users. So again, most, if not every one of you, are doing things via hypervisor, virtual machines. You can slice and dice and conjure up these servers like Harry Potter. And as long as you've got physically enough memory in your big ocean of memory to assign to these machines, plan on about 20% increase. That's the main, consequence of memory. If you're on iSeries, you're not going to show much benefit in 64-bit. Their operating system is already at 128-bit, and it already, a lot of that code already runs natively in that system. So again, you're going to be kind of a wash, but again, there's still a reason to go to 64-bit because you're going to want to be compatible with everything else that comes afterwards. Because Oracle is only going to support 64-bit sooner or later. Package build time, we've already covered that. There's an increase in package build runtime due to the dual maintenance. Again, anybody remember the urban legend? Who knows whether it's true or not? Bill Gates said, who's ever going to need more than 640K, right? I mean, I probably said more words than that in this presentation right now. And yet, what we have now is 64 bits, 18 quintillion bytes. Those of you who aren't up to with your taxonomy of your high numbers, it goes million, then 1,000 times that is a billion, then 1,000 times that is a trillion, then a quadrillion, then a quintillion. Lots of orders of magnitude, okay, in a very short period of time. So one of the things is that you can actually be exceeding machine memory, okay? Ask me how I know about that, Vern. How do I know about that? Well, one experiment I tried on our machines is you have a feature, maybe not all of you know about, on Server Manager that says, okay, calculate the call object kernel and run batch memory limit. Well, knowing that now the 2 gig per process limit has kind of gone the way of the Radio Shack TRS-80, now machine memory could be a limiting factor. And the result I got was 45 gigs. You could run a UBE and it could eat up to 45 gigs of memory, one process. So you do have the potential. You've got a lot of rope to hang yourself with 64-bit, okay? The process memory can get out of control. And just as a side note, we're just running this test, just running that test, and you're warned, you have a pop-up box that shows you, I had to reinstall the database client, okay, because it went ahead and blew away machine memory just doing the test, and it corrupted various things in the system that I had to reinstall and that I had to go and fix. Again, business function development, any custom functions, you'll have to view for possible retrofitting. Improvements will impact applications which are most heavily written in C code, okay? You will see some improvements due to the fact that you're running natively in 64-bit, not in that WoW 64 compatibility mode we mentioned. So anything UBEs that are a lot of C code, you're going to see more room for improvement there, as is business functions. Interactive applications that have most of the logic in event rules code, that's not impacted by 64-bit, so you won't see as much improvement there. Again, the only way we're going to get more knowledge of the idiosyncrasies in data over time is going to be as clients go live. So recommendations, your next tools upgrade should be 64-bit, period. You should get there as soon as possible. 64-bit is 923x or 924x plus extra steps that we've talked about. Eventually, Oracle's going to stop releasing 32-bit, so it makes sense maybe to go code current. If you need new hardware, operating systems, database, cloud, you need to conjure up more memory, you need to kind of refill the bucket on your hypervisors, now's the time to do that. So, finally, are there questions here?
Yep, we got a couple questions out there for you, Chris. But
right.
before we do that, since we're almost at the end, I'm going to pop one more poll question up to see who is interested in Trillium's assessment here. So you can go ahead and answer that as we get into the questions. First question I've got is, scrolling up here. During the upgrade process, can we run 64-bit in non-prod and 32-bit in prod? Just trying to think about the typical upgrade cycle during the testing phase.
So the question was, can you have one? And the answer is yes, that's how you'd recommend doing it, one path code at a time. You know, just the same way as you would if it were any other tools release, right? You'd have tools release N+1, you know, maybe running in dev, you know, and then move that up to PY, and then you'd have a massive go live, you know, big bang, you know, event that was done very carefully and very deliberately. So yeah, the short answer is yes. It's in that respect like any other tools release.
All right. As a follow-up to that same topic, do you need to do this on new hardware, or can it be done in place?
The question was, do we need to do
the 64-bit on new hardware, or can it be done in place on my existing hardware?
Can it be done in place? Well, again, as long as almost certainly your hardware and your OS are going to be 64-bit, you know, because almost everything is. So I guess as long as you've got the memory to accommodate the 20%, theoretically you could. Now, the way Trillium usually does things is not in place, right? With the whole virtual machines, we usually slice and dice and conjure up a parallel set of machines, and that you go and you flip the switch on those when you go live. So you're on new virtual machines, but you know, that's specific to the way we usually do things. But the answer is, yeah, I mean, there's nothing special about the hardware given it's all going to be 64-bit by now, but make sure that your memory, you know, is going to be compatible, is going to be allow that 20%.
All right. The last question we have, is there a tool you recommend to your clients for CRP testing? Spreadsheet, DWS tool, use process recorder, develop test, anything else?
A tool, the question was, is there a tool you recommend for what was that spreadsheet testing, he said, some other?
For CRP, currently they use spreadsheets or DWS tools. Is there anything else that we recommend?
Let's see. Dave, do you know what he might be getting at? I'm reading the question because I tend to be a visual person here. tools you recommend for a CRB, does this have to do a 64-bit or is this just a general question?
I think it's a general testing on CRP. My take from what I've seen is most of our clients, well, I've seen people use DWS and spreadsheets. The typical, most successful clients tend to have a set of scripts that they know they need to go to, and they actually go through the manual process of doing it, because while testing scripts are great, human interaction really kind of drives through, and actually some human mistakes
I see what you're
actually
saying.
drive
Right.
through finding those issues.
Okay.
There's a lot of tools out there that do testing, but it's hard to get as manually doing it.
To me, automated tell you need to have, pardon the expression, you need to have monkeys at keyboards punching in data the same way as humans would do it, when they're live. Otherwise, you're going to miss things. Things that those automated tools tend to not get is the wait time. They tend to measure blasting HTML at a server and getting a response. But things that take place on the browser, for example, because there is logic that takes place in the browser. There's JavaScript that runs, there's grids that have to be populated. If any of that stuff isn't working properly and or has performance rendering issues, you will not see that in automated testing, period. Load testing, those kind of things are fine, but human interaction, there's no substitute for humans actually doing the testing.
All right. Those are our questions today. I want to thank everybody for attending. Remember, we do have a session next week on external security threats to JD Edwards. Once again, thank you for your time today. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, David Toll at Trillium.com. Thanks very much. Bye-bye now.
Oh, that's important. Watch the fires.